Berlin, 1946. The war had been over for a year, but the city did not look like a place at peace. It looked like a place that had simply stopped exploding. Streets that once carried trams now carried footpaths worn between mountains of broken stone. Entire blocks had been reduced to outlines. A doorframe standing alone with no house behind it, a staircase climbing up into open sky. A bathtub balanced 3 floors above the ground with no floor beneath it anymore. Weeds had already begun finding their way up through the cracks in fallen masonry, the way weeds do, indifferent to what a stone used to be part of. At night, the city was quieter than it had ever been in living memory. No trams, no factory whistles, no sirens, which was its own strange kind of relief, though the silence they left behind had a weight to it that some residents found harder to sleep through than the noise ever had been. 16 million cubic meters of rubble covered this city alone. Across Germany, the number was closer to 400 million. Nobody had a plan for where it would go. Nobody at first had a plan for much of anything. Into this landscape walked a woman named Greta Lindqvist, 34 years old, a canvas sack over one shoulder and a small handcart behind her, its wheels slightly bent from a fall the winter before. She was not collecting anything anyone wanted. She was collecting bricks. To understand why, it helps to go back further still, to a spring morning in 1936, 10 years before any of this, when Greta was 24 and had gone to a neighbor's house to borrow a length of rope, and had instead found a young mason standing on a ladder in the garden, repairing a wall that did not, by any reasonable measure, need repairing. "It leans," Anton had told her, without turning around, as though this explained everything. "It's a garden wall," she'd said. "It's allowed to lean a little." He had turned around then, and given her a look of mock offense that she would come to know very well over the following years. The look he gave anyone who suggested that a wall, or a chimney, or a door frame was allowed to do anything less than exactly what it was supposed to do. They married the following year. Anton built the fireplace in their first flat with his own hands, refusing 3 separate times to let the bricklayer he'd hired finish it. Until finally he simply took the trowel himself and did it the way he wanted it done. Greta used to tease him that he trusted brick more than he trusted most people, and he would tell her, half joking and half not, that brick had never once let him down when he treated it properly, which was more than could be said for most people either. She spent those years learning him the way you learn a language mostly by listening, not studying his trade on purpose, simply absorbing it the way you absorb anything you live alongside for long enough. The particular scrape of a trowel-drawn level, the dry, disapproving click of his tongue when a course sat even slightly out of true. The patience he brought to work that most people would have rushed, because a wall built in a hurry, he told her once, is a wall that fails you exactly when you need it most. She had no idea in those years that she was storing away a trade of her own. Anton was sent east in the autumn of 1943, one name among a great many names moving through a war that no longer had any clear edges to it. For a while there had been letters, short, careful, the kind a man writes when he knows someone else may read it before his wife does. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about missing her bread, which he said, with the small dry humor she had married him for, was the one thing the army could not properly replace. He wrote, in the last letter that ever reached her, that he had fixed a chimney in the farmhouse where his unit was billeted, because the farmer's wife reminded him of his mother, and he could not stand to watch her freeze. Then the letters stopped. Not all at once, in the way a door closing makes a sound. They simply thinned and thinned until 1 month there was no letter at all, and then another month, and then it was 1944, and then it was 1945, and the war itself ended around her in May with church bells and Soviet soldiers, and a silence in her chest that never really left. No telegram came, no official notice. In the chaos of that final year, entire units had simply dissolved into the retreat, their records lost with them. Greta spent the rest of 1945 doing what tens of thousands of German women did that year. Standing in lines outside the Red Cross tracing office, reading lists of names pinned to notice boards, writing letters to addresses that no longer existed, to camps that may or may not have held him, to hospitals that could not say. Nobody ever told her Anton was dead. Nobody ever told her he was alive either. By the time the leaves turned again in 1946, she had stopped waiting for a specific answer and had begun, instead, to live inside the space where an answer should have been. It was in that silence that she found his tools. They had been in a wooden box under the floorboards of the room that no longer had an outer wall, a room that had taken the same blast that had killed a family 2 doors down and left Greta, by the accident of which side of the corridor she'd been standing on, alive. The box had survived. The level inside it, a beautiful old thing with a brass-cased bubble her father-in-law had given Anton as an apprentice, had survived too. The glass unbroken. She kept the box on the kitchen table for 3 days before she touched anything inside it again. What she did with those tools, in the end, was the part nobody expected. Each morning, while the frost was still on the broken stone, Greta walked out into the ruins 2 streets from her building and began to sort, not scavenge. Sort. She picked up bricks one at a time, turned them over in gloved hands, checked the corners for chips, tapped them once against another brick to listen for the sound. A good brick rang, faintly, almost like a bell struck underwater. A cracked one gave back nothing. Just a flat, disappointing thud that told her everything she needed to know before she'd even finished the motion. The good ones went into the cart. The broken ones stayed on the pile, to be picked over later by children who used them for other games entirely, building small crooked towers that fell over by evening. Her neighbors watched from their windows and did not understand. "There is no money in old bricks," said Frau Ostermann, who lived below her and had lost her own husband and her son, and had very little patience left for things that did not put bread on a table. She said this leaning out of her window with a cigarette she had traded 2 days of her butter ration to obtain, watching Greta's cart creak past below. "You are wasting daylight, Greta. Daylight you could spend standing in the ration line." Greta did not argue. She simply nodded, said good morning, and kept walking. It was not only the adults who noticed her. The children of the street. There were perhaps a dozen of them still living in the building, and the 2 beside it. Thin and quick and endlessly resourceful in the way children become when there is very little to be a child with. Took to following her cart at a distance for a while that autumn, half curious, half mocking, calling out in the sing-song way children have for teasing something they don't understand. "Ziegelfrau, Ziegelfrau." "Brickwoman, Brickwoman." She never told them to stop. Once she let the smallest of them, a boy of perhaps 6 who had lost most of his front teeth to poor nutrition rather than age, help her carry a brick to the cart. He held it with both arms the way you'd hold something enormous and important, staggered the 10 steps to the cart, and set it down with a triumphant thump. After that, he stopped calling her Ziegelfrau quite so mockingly. The other children noticed, and slowly, over weeks, the name began to lose some of its edge, even if it never entirely disappeared. By the 2nd week, though, the men who gathered near the standpipe to smoke and trade news still used it as a joke among themselves. Die Ziegelfrau, the brick woman. It was not said kindly, not at first. In a city where everyone was hungry, spending your strength on stone rather than food looked, to most people, like a kind of madness, or worse, like something you did when you had given up trying to survive and had decided instead simply to keep your hands busy until the end came. What none of them knew, because Greta did not explain herself, not out of pride, but because she had learned that words did not fill anyone's stomach and neither did arguments, was that she remembered something Anton used to say. A wall built from mismatched, mortarless brick, stacked dry and packed with rubble, dust, and ash between the courses, holds heat longer than people think. Not as well as a proper wall, but far, far better than canvas sheeting nailed over a hole where a window used to be, which was what most of her street was using to keep the winter out. Her building had taken a partial hit in the final weeks of the war. The east-facing room of her flat had lost its outer wall entirely. She had spent the summer of 1945 sleeping in the one intact room, listening to wind move through the gap like something breathing. She did not have money for a builder. She did not have ration coupons to spare for one, either. Builders wanted paying in cigarettes or coffee or butter, and Greta had none of these. What she had was time, 2 working hands, and a trade half-remembered from years of watching rather than doing. Her first attempt in late July collapsed. She had stacked the bricks too quickly, eager to see a wall rise, and had not packed the courses evenly enough with the ash and dust that were supposed to hold them steady against each other. A gust of wind one evening. Nothing dramatic. nothing that should have troubled a properly built wall at all. Brought the top 3 courses down in a clatter that brought Frau Ostermann to her own window to see what had happened, and gave Greta a bruised shin and, worse, a bruised confidence that took her 2 full days to recover from. She sat with the fallen bricks for a long while that evening, turning Anton's trowel over in her hands, trying to remember exactly how he had held it, exactly the angle at which he had drawn it across a bed of mortar dust to level a course before setting the next brick down. She began again the next morning. Slower this time. She packed each course more carefully, checked each brick with a level laid flat across 3 others at once, the way she remembered him doing when a wall needed to stay true over a long run. When a course looked uneven, she took it apart and reset it rather than continuing on top of a mistake. A discipline that cost her time she did not feel she had to spare, but that she forced herself to keep to anyway. So she built. Brick by brick through the late summer and into the autumn of 1946, she raised a wall where a wall had been torn away. She packed the gaps with brick dust and ash swept from cold hearths. She scavenged a window frame, glass still miraculously intact, from a collapsed shopfront 4 streets over, and fitted it herself, standing on an upturned crate, tongue between her teeth in concentration. By October, she had a room again. A whole room with 4 walls and glass in the window and a door that closed. Her neighbors noticed. They did not say much, but they noticed. To understand the shape of her life that autumn, it helps to walk through one single day of it, because the days themselves, more than any single dramatic moment, were what actually built the room that would matter so much by January. She woke, most mornings, before the light did. Not from any particular discipline, but because the cold itself woke her. The flat had 1 small stove, fed sparingly, and by 4 or 5 in the morning its warmth had usually faded enough that the chill found its way even under the 2 blankets she kept folded together. On the bed she and Anton had once shared. She would lie still for a while in the dark, listening. The building had its own set of sounds by then, sounds she had come to know the way you come to know a person's breathing beside you. A loose shutter 2 floors up that knocked twice against its frame whenever wind came from the east. The particular creak of the 3rd stair from the bottom, which everyone in the building had learned, without ever discussing it, to step over rather than on. Somewhere below, Frau Ostermann's grandson coughing in his sleep, a small dry sound through thin walls. By the time real light came, gray and reluctant through the 1 window that still had glass, Greta would already be dressed. 2 layers of everything, a scarf wound twice around her throat, gloves with the fingertips worn through from months of handling brick. She ate little in the mornings. Bread, when there was bread. Sometimes only water, boiled on the stove and drunk slowly to warm her hands around the cup before the walk out. The walk to the ruins took 12 minutes, a route she could have made with her eyes closed by October. Past the bakery that no longer baked anything but still had its sign. Past the corner where a florist's shop had once stood, and where now only the cast iron frame of its awning remained, rusting slowly into the shape of something that might once have held flowers. At the ruins themselves, she worked in a rhythm that had become almost meditative by then, though she would not have used that word for it herself. Lift, turn, tap, listen. Lift, turn, tap, listen. The cold made the work harder in some ways. Her fingers stiffened inside her gloves within the first half hour, and she had learned to stop every so often and press her palms together, flexing them, before continuing. But the cold also made the work strangely easier to bear, in that it gave her something specific and immediate to focus on, a problem with a clear physical shape, at a time when so much else in her life had no shape at all. She stopped for a few minutes around midday, usually sitting on an overturned block of masonry, with her back against a wall that no longer belonged to any building, eating whatever small thing she had brought with her. Watching the street below where other people moved through their own versions of the same gray, careful day, she often saw the same faces. A man delivering something on a bicycle with a bent wheel not unlike her own cart's. 2 women walking arm in arm toward the market, talking in the low, continuous murmur of people who have found, in each other, one of the few remaining comforts available to them. Children, always children, moving through the ruins with the strange, unbothered freedom that children seem to find even in landscapes that should, by any reasonable measure, frighten them. By early afternoon, the cart would be full, or as full as she had strength left to pull, and she would make the return walk, slower now, the wheels catching more often on the uneven ground under the added weight. The afternoons were for building. This was the part of the day she found, if she was honest with herself, that she looked forward to. Not because the work was easy, but because it was the one part of her day where the shape of the future was, for a few hours at least, entirely in her own hands. A wall does not care whether the person building it is grieving. It only cares whether each course sits level on the one beneath it. There was something in that indifference that Greta found, unexpectedly, almost restful. She worked until the light failed, which came earlier each week as autumn deepened into winter, and then she cleaned her tools, wiping the trowel, coiling the string line, setting the level back into its box with something close to reverence, and climbed the stairs to whatever remained of her evening. Some evenings there was nothing to do but sit by the small stove and mend something, a stocking or a glove, by the light of a single candle, rationed as carefully as everything else. Some evenings Frau Ostermann's grandson knocked on her door with some small question or small piece of gossip from the street, and Greta would let him sit for a while, glad, more than she would ever have admitted, of the noise. And some evenings, more often than she told anyone, she simply sat with Anton's box of tools open on the table in front of her, running a thumb along the worn wooden handle of the trowel, saying nothing at all, until it was late enough that sleep, however thin and cold, finally came to take the day away from her. It was an unremarkable life on the surface. Nobody watching a single one of those days would have thought there was anything in it worth remembering. But days like that, stacked one on top of another through an entire autumn, were exactly what a wall is made of. Not one dramatic gesture, but hundreds of small, careful, repeated ones, each of them unremarkable alone, each of them necessary together. That autumn, the newspapers began carrying a word that made people's shoulders tighten when they read it. Coal in Mongol. Coal shortage. The mines in the Ruhr were producing again, but slowly, and the trains that should have carried coal into Berlin were unreliable, damaged, competing for priority, with grain shipments and machinery parts, and everything else a broken country needed, all at once. Ration cards for coal were issued that year for a fraction of what a household actually needed to survive a German winter. Families were told to expect perhaps 2 sacks for the entire season. Some received less. Some, in the outer districts, received none at all. Greta stood in one of those coal lines herself in late October, more out of a wish to remain unremarkable than any real hope of a useful allocation. Ahead of her in the line, a woman with 2 small children pressed close against her coat, argued quietly, then loudly, with the clerk behind the counter, who could only spread his hands and repeat, in the flat voice of a man who had repeated the same sentence 40 times that morning already, that there was simply nothing more to give out this week. The woman did not shout. She simply stood there a moment too long, holding her children's hands, before turning and walking back out into the cold with the same 2 sacks she'd come with, empty. Greta watched this and said nothing. But she thought about it later. Sorting bricks, the way you think about something that has quietly confirmed a suspicion you did not want confirmed. Nobody yet knew, though a few of the older residents, the ones who remembered the winter of 1928 and had a farmer's instinct for weather, had started saying uneasy things about the color of the autumn sky, that the winter approaching them would become one of the coldest of the entire century in Europe. Rivers would freeze solid enough to walk across. Birds would drop from the air mid-flight. In the months that followed, more people in occupied Germany would die from cold and the hunger that came with it than had died in some entire years of bombing. Greta did not know any of this either, not with certainty. But she had spent a season rebuilding a wall by hand, and in the process she had learned something the rest of her street had not yet had reason to learn. A single wall, however carefully built, would not be enough, so she kept collecting. Through November, while her neighbors queued for coal rations that arrived late or not at all, Greta returned each morning to the ruins with her cart. She was no longer only rebuilding her own flat. She had begun, quietly, without announcement, bricking in the disused storage room at the base of the stairwell, the one that had lost its door in the same blast that had taken her wall. the one every resident in the building walked past every day without a second glance, using it mostly as a place to lean bicycles that no longer had tires. Frau Ostermann asked her, not unkindly this time, what she thought she was doing. Making somewhere warm, Greta said. In case of what? Greta did not have a satisfying answer. She only had the memory of Anton's voice, and the ache in her hands, and a feeling she could not fully explain. The same instinct, perhaps that makes a person store an extra candle, or keep a second key, or check twice that a door is locked. Not certainty. Just care, extended a little further than seemed strictly necessary. She lined the little room with brick on the inside of its old stone walls, leaving a narrow air gap between the two layers. The way she had once watched Anton insulate the cold store behind a butcher's shop before the war. She packed the gap with ash and brick dust, and when those ran short, torn newspaper, soaked and dried into a kind of stiff, papery wadding. It was slow work. Her hands cracked, in the cold, the skin splitting at the knuckles in a way that stung every time she flexed her fingers around another brick. There was a week in late November when she very nearly stopped altogether, when the short days and the gray light and the sheer, grinding repetition of the work made the whole project feel suddenly foolish. A woman alone bricking up a broom closet, while the rest of the city queued sensibly for coal that at least had the virtue of being an official, sanctioned kind of hope. She sat on the floor of that half-finished room one evening, Anton's trowel loose in her hand, and allowed herself, for perhaps the only time that autumn, to cry. Not loudly, not for long, but completely, the way you cry when you are tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Then she wiped her face with the back of a dusty glove, picked the trowel back up, and kept going, because stopping, she found, was somehow harder than continuing had been. By early December, the room was sealed. A single small stove, salvaged from a bombed-out laundry and patched with wire, and a scavenged length of pipe, stood in one corner, its flue run crudely up through a gap in the old chimney. It was not comfortable. It was not much to look at, but it held heat. The worst of it arrived in January. Temperatures in Berlin fell to levels the city had not recorded in living memory. In the first week alone, the thermometer nailed outside the corner, grocer's shuttered window, dropped lower each morning than the morning before, until the numbers stopped meaning very much to anyone beyond the simple fact that stepping outside for more than a few minutes had become something to plan for, not something to do carelessly. By the second week, the spree had frozen thick enough to bear weight, and children who should have known better were sternly warned away from it by parents who remembered other winters and other frozen rivers that had seemed just as solid, right up until they weren't. Pipes burst in buildings across every district, including, eventually, in Greta's own building. The water supply to the upper floors failed entirely for 11 days, and residents carried buckets up 4 flights of stairs from a standpipe that itself froze solid, more mornings than not, requiring someone to go down early with a kettle of hot water simply to free it enough for the rest of the building to draw from. Coal allocations already thin were cut further. Families burned furniture. Families burned books. In some buildings, residents pulled up floorboards from rooms no longer in use and fed them, plank by plank, into stoves designed for coal. The young couple from the building next door, Carl and Ilse, married only the previous spring in a ceremony held in a church with half its roof still under repair, had been managing, just barely, in a single small room until a ceiling pipe above them finally gave way in the second week of January, sending a sheet of freezing water down through the plaster and leaving the room unusable within the hour. Carl carried what dry belongings they had left out into the corridor, while Ilse stood in the doorway with her coat still on, watching water drip steadily from the light fixture, too cold and too tired to do anything but stare at it. The elderly widower on the third floor, Herr Brandt, had lived alone since his wife's death the previous winter, and had grown, in that year, quietly and stubbornly resistant to asking anyone for anything. His own small stove had developed a hairline crack across its base sometime in December. He never said exactly when, or admitted how long he had simply worked around it, feeding it smaller fires to keep the crack from widening. Sleeping in every coat he owned, layered one over another, rather than admit the stove could no longer be trusted with a proper fire. Frau Ostermann's flat, on the ground floor, had 2 windows that had never been properly repaired since 1945. Canvas sheeting nailed over broken panes, patched again and again but never truly sealed. By the second week of January, with her coal ration exhausted and her small grandson running a fever that would not break, she did something she had not expected to do. She knocked on the door of the little brick room at the base of the stairs. Greta opened it into a wall of warmth that made Frau Ostermann's eyes water, not from smoke, but simply from the shock of heat after days without it. "I have almost no coal left," Greta said. It was true. She had been rationing her own small store carefully for weeks, feeding the stove only enough to keep the room from dropping to freezing. Never enough to feel warm in it herself. But there is room by the stove, and it will hold the heat for hours after the fire is out, if the door stays shut. Word did not travel loudly that week. It traveled the way word travels between people who are too tired and too cold to waste it on anything but what is necessary. By the following evening, Carl and Ilse had found their way to the same door, their few dry belongings bundled under one arm. By the evening after that, so had Herr Brandt, arriving without a word of explanation, simply standing in the doorway until Greta stepped aside to let him in, and settling into a corner near the stove with the particular dignity of a man determined not to look grateful even as the warmth visibly loosened the set of his shoulders. That first night, 5 people slept in a room built for storing broken bicycles and empty crates. Frau Ostermann and her grandson, his fever finally breaking somewhere around midnight in the warmth. Herr Brandt, upright in his chair, refusing on principle to lie down on the floor with the younger people, but asleep within the hour regardless. Carl and Ilse, close together against the wall furthest from the door, Ilse's head on Carl's shoulder, both of them silent in the particular way of people who have simply run out of things to be afraid of that day. It became, without anyone deciding it should, a nightly arrangement. Each evening as the light failed, the same small group made their way down to the room at the base of the stairs, sometimes joined by 1 or 2 others from the building whose own stoves had given out for the night. Greta kept the fire low and careful, feeding it just enough to hold the warmth through until morning, rationing the little coal she had left the way a person rations. Anything they know cannot be replaced until the trains run properly again. Nobody called her the brick woman that winter or any winter after. The winter of 1946 into 1947 did not end quickly. Even in March, ice still lay thick in the shadowed corners of the courtyard, and the ration situation across the city remained desperate, long after the temperature began slowly to climb. But something in Greta's building had changed, and it did not change back. Herr Brandt, once the weather warmed, began appearing at the ruins some mornings with his own cart, sorting bricks alongside Greta without being asked, the 2 of them working for long stretches in a companionable silence that neither felt any need to fill with conversation. He was slower than she was, and his hands shook slightly now in the cold mornings. But he had, it turned out, a mason's patience of his own, learned decades earlier in a trade he had left behind for other work as a younger man, and it came back to him, he said once, more easily than he expected. Carl and Ilse found a proper flat by early summer, 2 streets over, in a building that had also taken damage but that Carl, with a season's worth of watching Greta work, felt confident enough now to help repair himself. Before they left, Carl spent 2 full days helping Greta reinforce the brick room's roof against the following winter. Refusing to accept anything in return beyond the meal, Ilse insisted on cooking for the 3 of them on the little stove that had kept them all alive in January. Frau Ostermann never did learn to lay a brick herself, but she took, that spring, to keeping a pot of something warm on her own stove most evenings and leaving her door unlatched in case anyone on the stairs needed a place to sit for a while that wasn't the brick room, a small, quiet echo of the thing Greta had built, offered in the only currency Frau Ostermann had left to give. Yet in one small building in Wedding, there was now a room at the base of the stairs that everyone knew about, and that anyone was welcome to use when the cold outsides became more than a body could stand. Greta never called it anything in particular. Her neighbors eventually started calling it simply Die Warm Stube, the warm room. She kept collecting bricks that spring too, though there was less urgency to it now. Other buildings on the street had noticed what she'd built and asked, hesitantly at first, whether she might show them how it was done. She did. She had never minded teaching, only being watched and judged while she worked in silence, which was a different thing entirely. Nobody erected a statue to Greta Lindqvist. No plaque marks the building, which no longer stands in its 1946 form. Her name would not appear in any history written about that winter, one among tens of thousands of ordinary people who simply did what needed doing with the little they had. But for one winter, in one small room she had built with her own hands, out of stone that everyone else had walked past and called worthless. She was warm, and so, in the end, were the people who had once laughed at her for gathering it. The building itself is gone now, replaced sometime in the 1960s by one of the plain, functional apartment blocks that rose across so much of the city during those decades of rebuilding. Good, solid, unremarkable housing. The kind nobody photographs and nobody writes about, which is itself a kind of quiet victory for a city that spent so long being neither of those things. Nobody living in that building today knows that a room once stood roughly where their own ground floor storage closet now stands. A room built brick by a woman with no training, no money, and no certainty that any of it would matter. There is no way for them to know it, and there is no particular reason they should. That is simply how most of history moves. Not in monuments, but in small, unrecorded rooms that keep people warm for one winter, then are built over, then are forgotten. Then exist only in the fact that the people who slept there survived to have children and grandchildren who never think to ask what kept their grandparents alive during the coldest winter of the century. Because by the time they were old enough to ask, it had simply become one more ordinary fact of the family's history, mentioned in passing, if it was mentioned at all. Greta herself lived into her 80s. She never remarried, though by all accounts, she was not a woman who spent her later years in mourning. She simply, quietly, kept building. She helped repair 3 more buildings on her street before 1950. She taught, over the following decade, more people than she ever kept count of how to lay a true course of brick, how to listen for the sound that told you whether a stone could be trusted, how to pack a gap so it would hold heat through a night that asked more of a wall than any wall should reasonably be expected to give. Anton was never found. No grave. No confirmed record, nothing beyond the silence that had settled over his name sometime in 1944 and never lifted. Greta kept his tools for the rest of her life. Neighbors who knew her in her later years say she still used the same trowel, decades on, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark by that point from more hands than just his and hers, passed by then, to whichever of her informal apprentices happened to need it on a given afternoon. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a city once its coldest winter has passed and been survived. Not celebration. There was very little to celebrate that spring of 1947, in a Berlin still years from anything resembling normal life. Just a kind of settling, a slow exhale that took months to complete. Somewhere in that exhale, in one small room that no longer exists, in a building that no longer stands, on a street that has been rebuilt so many times over that almost nothing of its 1946 shape remains. 5 people once sat together through the coldest night any of them had ever known, warmed by stone that everyone else had called worthless, gathered by a woman everyone had once found something to mock. If you are listening to this somewhere warm tonight, it is worth remembering, for just a moment before sleep takes you, how much of what keeps a person warm was never grand to begin with. It was only ever brick by brick, course by course. One ordinary, unremarkable day, stacked carefully on top of another, by someone who kept going long after it would have been easier to stop.